Well, hey, welcome everybody. This is Darin Francis from Harbinger Lane, uh, joined today by Laurie Koehler of Koehler Consulting and Melvin Hines from Upswing, and we're here on the new Signals in Higher Ed podcast that we're putting out from Harbinger Lane, looking at everything in a positive light relative to innovation and bringing new ideas and perspectives to improving the odds of success with higher education, in particular in the U.S. So super excited to be talking to you, Melvin, today and having a conversation. I thought it made most sense to bring Laurie in because last year at this time, Upswing released its annual Anna Insights report for 2024, and we were having conversations about it, and then asked you to be a part of letting us just interview you via Laurie and understand the impact of this report a little better. I remember that, and just thinking back about it at the time, I remember being struck by how comprehensive this report was, but also how revealing it was about the state of the non-traditional student experience in higher education. And so I'm really excited to kind of, people can go back and on the Harbinger Lane website and see our original newsletter that we put out if they'd like to from last year, or they can certainly come to your website and download previous reports as well. But I'm excited just to pick up and sort of see where things have gone over the last year. But before we get there, for those that just don't know Upswing and don't know in particular your story, could you just give us a few minutes about your, like how you got to even start a company like Upswing and what Upswing is doing for universities today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me back again this year to share a little bit more of the insights that we've been gaining. Um, Upswing was started back in 2013, and the whole idea was that I wanted to find ways to help support students that came from backgrounds that were similar to mine. I originally grew up in a small town in South Georgia called Albany, and in my hometown, we didn't always have a lot of those resources that you typically tend to see in, more affluent high schools and more affluent communities. And so, in my class of 250 students, there were only 68 of us that ultimately graduated, and even fewer of us went on to college. So, to me, when I eventually did go to the University of Georgia, it was a really big deal for my hometown and my community, but when I got there, that was when I kind of got the vision into what the other half looks like and how the other half lives, and I started to see that there were people who had all sorts of SAT and ACT prep courses that were offered by their high schools, and who had all different types of AP courses and IB courses and all those types of things, and you really began to sense that, man, there are some students who it doesn't matter how hard they worked in high school, they're just not at the same preparedness level as other students. And that really led me to want to have the opportunity to support students that were from those backgrounds that had some of those needs and challenges, to get that same level of preparedness and the same ability to be able to support themselves as all these other students would have. And so that was really where the first fruits of Upswing started. I originally started off in higher ed with teaching at North Carolina Central University. So I was in Durham, North Carolina. At the time, I had just finished going through grad school at Duke University, and I was teaching at the local HBCU there, and certainly was a lot closer in age to the students there. So they were asking me a lot of questions about just everything, not just inside the classroom, but outside the classroom as well. And that really led me to realize that this challenge, this need that I was talking about, wasn't just in South Georgia, but was all over the country. So in 2013, we launched Upswing, which is one of the modules that we have today. And we started purposefully working with rural communities in North Carolina. Um, our first two colleges were Bladen Community College and Central Carolina Community College as well. And both of those partners still work with us to this day, which I'm really proud to say. But our whole aim was that we wanted to see, could we level that playing field and help to give people that level of opportunity and success. And so we started to do that specifically with academic support. Eventually, we added on different types of advising and coaching support. Eventually, we added on our virtual assistant Anna, which the Anna Insights report is based off of. And then we started looking at how can we support students with basic needs. So students who are struggling with maybe finding food uh, or housing security for the night, or childcare services, or transportation options. And finally, we really wanted to make sure that we could support them mentally as well. So providing different types of mental health supports. And so those make up the 5 pillars of Upswing today. And so today we work with around 800,000 students across about 80 different college partners. Um, and we've certainly been excited about some of the work that we've been able to see, some of the impact we've been able to have, but also some of the stories that we're able to tell. And that's a big part of the reason why we're so excited about putting out these on insights reports every year.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's a great story. And I'm curious, maybe what prompted you to create such a comprehensive report, this honor report? I mean, what was the impetus of that? Was it primarily just to help your existing institutions understand the value of what they were getting in the aggregate, or was there something beyond that as well?
Absolutely, beyond that, for sure. So, you know, as everyone knows, we're kind of in the midst of a lot of just kind of AI chatbots and things like that that persist. When we created Anna, we actually launched it back in 2017. So certainly before this whole craze took place. And originally, Anna stood for Academic Notification Assistant. What we wanted to do was support students in their classrooms by sending them reminders about tests and assignments and exams and things like that, so that they could stay abreast of whatever they need to do to make sure they get a good grade in that classroom. What started to happen was, because we allowed Anna to be open ended, to where we would reply back, and it wasn't just a chatbot that was responding. Students started asking about all sorts of things that weren't part of our original intention, and that's what led us to recognize that if we were going to really and truly be helpful and supportive for these students, we had to cover more and more of these bases that were coming out. At that point in time, the way in which we thought about doing that was by through our partnerships with our admins, through what we call our HERO program, Higher Education Retention Officers, which are folks who are part of Upswing that basically act as consultants to the schools. Um, we were sharing with them some of these nuggets of wisdom, nuggets of insights that we were learning. We then started to aggregate them by different school types. So community colleges would get certain types of information, HBCUs, HSIs. But then we started to recognize that there's such a wealth of data here, and the needs happen so quickly that if we could actually put it into an annual report, we could begin to help support even more students across even more different types of colleges on a faster basis. And so that's really where the idea of the Honor Insights report came from. I remember one of the first things that we thought about when we were beginning to do these things was COVID, and how suddenly so many of these non-traditional students were at home and not able to access their coursework and curriculum and things like that, their instructors, because if they did have a laptop and if they did have, um, good Wi-Fi at home, which wasn't always the case, they were sharing it with their kids, because a lot of these non-traditional students were also adult learners and student parents. And so uh, we actually had to reach out to several of our college partners to let them know that, hey, this is a challenge that many of your students are having. That's why you're not seeing them show up in class. And that's what led to the establishment of laptop loan programs and things like that that really helped to create that bridge. Well, if we could do that just with a couple of partners based off of what we were noticing really quickly, what could we do if we shared an entire insight report to the industry? And so that's a big part of why we want to be able to do this every year.
That's great. And it actually it tracks for me from the first time I read it. I was like, this isn't about, whatever 80 schools, which is impressive. This is actually uh, it'd be hard to make the argument that it wasn't a broader because of the types of institutions you serve and the ways in which you're gathering this data. It's hard to not see it as uh, a defining resource around non-traditional student education in the U.S. at least.
I hope so.
But what about? I guess maybe just could you give us like your sense of a highlight or the biggest finding or trend, uh, maybe that keeps you up at night, or maybe that's either in a good way or a bad way. But I'm just curious, like what's the thing that jumps off the page if you could only choose one?
um, yeah. So anyone who's in higher ed, of course, knows that there have been a lot of changes this year, um, up and down the totem pole. And I think we tend to think about it in terms of how it affects our institutions. Um, perhaps there are funding cuts and we have to figure out where or will institutions survive some of those funding cuts? If so, where are those going to come from? We've thought about it in terms of different types of services and whether or not those services can still be offered by the institutions or not. Um, what I don't think has bubbled up as much has been the impact of all of this on specifically those students who are going through this uncertain time, as they're as they're trying to also figure out whether or not it still makes sense for them to believe in higher education as a source for upward mobility. And that is probably one of the biggest takeaways that I would say jumps out of the page from me from the Audit Insight Support. It's the fact that when you take a look at, um, we can ask questions about financial aid and we'll get into some of those things. And you can ask questions about academic support needs and we'll get into those things. And of course, mental health has been something that people have talked about for a long time. But when you just ask students in general how they're feeling right now in this moment and what do they need, and you see this trend line from last year's fall report to spring to this year's fall report and spring, and you see that trend line going negative, and then you start to ask that question why, and you see these things pop up, what you're beginning to learn and understand and see is that there are whole swaths of college students who were already stressed and challenged by COVID and by having to figure out how to navigate the post COVID world and, by debt and everything else that goes into being a student. But now they're being even more stressed by just all the changes and challenges that have been taking place over the course of the last 12 months. And I think that if we don't figure out how to navigate specifically that specific challenge for students, um, we could see quite a few more students than usual dropping out. We could see quite a few more of them not believe in higher education as that upper mobility tool. I think that we'll see a pretty big reckoning there. And so that's the biggest takeaway that I hope that people glean from our report.
It's a stern warning. I mean, really, it's a sobering one. Laurie, let me bring you into this. So as you know, Melvin, but Laurie, as a former VP of enrollment, has quite a bit of background here. I wanted her to kind of weigh in and help us talk through a little more of the insight report as well. So Laurie, why don't you jump in?
Sure. And thanks for having me here. And Melvin, every time I get to talk with you, I'm I'm inspired by the work you're doing. So thank you for taking, I think that the best work comes out of our own experiences and our own needs, and you're living that, and helping how many students?
800,000 so far, so and counting.
That's a few. You mentioned financial challenges, and one of the things that stood out to me was the statistic from the report that nearly 50% of students prioritized financial aid information at the start of the fall semester. And I'm curious how that was different from the year before, and um, what kinds of recommendations are you providing to your partner institutions about how to address that significant need of their students?
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the tent poles of interest and activity when it comes to uh, really peeling back the onion and understanding where some of that anxiety and that stress is coming from for students. Financial aid, particularly for the types of students who we work with, who tend to be more non-traditional and adult learners. That's something that has really helped them to navigate the college experience. What we are seeing is that with some of the pullback in financial aid, and by the way, that's the recent thing. That's the thing that is the talk of the town today. But last year, if you recall, it was just the muddledness, or whatever you want to call it, of the FAFSA rollout. Um, and then the delay in the rollout that took place subsequently have all been you can see how that has impacted students in the data that we're seeing. So this year, what we're noticing is that there are much fewer students asking for help specifically with financial aid. Um, if they are, they're asking very basic questions about how to get started, and much more in the way of students asking for um, us to point them to scholarship programs, work study programs, perhaps privatized loans, um, things that can help them to feel a little bit more confident and more certain that they'll be able to not just make this semester's payment that's already due, but make next semester's payment as well. And so, what I would suggest, to colleges and universities who are listening to this is that we know that we want to make sure that we need financial aid to be that same kind of fulcrum for some of these students because it plays such an outsized role. But for us to really help support students today while we're still trying to ensure that we're supporting their tomorrow, we need to really think creatively and outside the box about how are ways in which we can make sure that these students are able to pay uh, for some of these costs. And that could include different types of scholarship opportunities that the local communities are offering that students might not already know about. It could include pointing students to resources, like we were talking about before, these basic need support resources that already are available to students that they don't even know exist. One of the stats that I really like to point out is that we started a partnership for basic need support through a partnership with an organization called um, Single Stop. And Single Stop is a nonprofit that really helps to allow students to navigate what are all those resources in their local communities, but also what are some of those resources that we were just talking about, right? Not financial aid, but things that are in the form of SNAP benefits or in the form of free school lunches for their children. And what they're finding are is that they qualify for over $20,000 in benefits per year that they didn't even know that they qualified for. So if we can give students the ability to not only become aware of but actually easily apply for some of those resources, now we're taking the burden off of them. Now we can help them to get back to the business of just being a student and trying to understand how to navigate their course curriculum.
Yeah, that statistic, I think you're referencing the 42% of students who needed help paying basic bills. Uh, um, it sounds like what you're referencing are helping them identify resources beyond the college, but the college playing a role in facilitating that.
Exactly, exactly. From the college perspective, I think that historically, some colleges have seen their role as being educators, and that's the beginning and the end of that, right? But from the student perspective, they just see college as yet another bill, right? Um, there's the bill that I have to pay to figure out how I'm going to get my car fixed. There's the bill I have to pay to figure out who is going to take care of my child while I'm in school. There's the bill that I have to figure out for, how am I going to get my housing paid for or my utilities covered while I'm maybe going from full time to part time, so that I can take the time to become a student at my institution. So there are all these different expenses that are associated with going to college that I think that a lot of times, college educators haven't always seen uh, be part of the student experience. And so now, what we're seeing is that is changing, right? We're seeing that we're seeing more and more people brought into the higher education landscape that are focused a lot more on coaching and mental health support and emergency need support and things like that. And if we can find ways to connect students with those resources that are already available to them at the local, a lot of times the state level, and even the federal level, we can help to take off some of that burden, even as we're recognizing that just the overall support costs have gone down, in general, in some of these communities.
I think kind of tying in here a little bit to the role of the institution in supporting the student. Clearly, um, bells ring when we start talking about retention and completion. And clearly, the data in this report again shows students respond better to early academic support. I feel like we shouldn't have to say this, but they do, right? And but I also recognize that this could be an example of a tool that your clients at the university have to go make a case. I'm hopeful about that, but has the Anna report, in your knowledge, helped institutions sort of strategize more around increasing earlier intervention? Are there examples of that you can think of?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I was saying earlier, one of the biggest reasons why we even wanted to start this was because we were noticing, some of the challenges coming in with laptop loan programs, at the start of COVID. The reason why we created our mental health module was because we also started seeing that same thing take place from a mental health perspective. So with the ANA Insights report, the goal is to make sure that we're creating some of those same early indicators, of challenges that we're seeing, of needs that we're having, and I think that we're seeing that become much more successful as well. One of our partners is North Carolina A&T, and they're about an hour down the road from where Upswing is based, and we've had the privilege of working with our students for the last 7 or 8 years. Um, and what we've seen is that, through their use of ANA and through their use of not only some of these early notifications, but also escalations that we do with them as well, it's really led to them to start to ask certain questions about what can we do to make sure that we're helping to support, our students 24/7, right? Not just when the campus is open, but 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so, through that partnership with them and through some of the data that we've been showing via ANA, they're actually looking at, uh, leveraging the mental health support, through our partnership there to provide 24/7 one-on-one teletherapy services to their students. Because what we've noticed is that number has not waned, right? Especially amongst HBCUs, one of the things that we were hearing be told, over and over again in the past was that, um, in some ways, perhaps, the Black community is less is more inoculated from some of these stressors and things like that. But what we found over the course of the last couple of years, and by the way, this is what we have actually shared with our HBCU impacts insight report, is that the number of students that have um, mentioned and talked about potential, suicidal ideation, things like that, have actually been much faster in our HBCU communities than in our non-HBCU communities. So now we're recognizing that we need to be much more proactive earlier, not just on the academic side, but also on the mental health side, to get them to open up and ask these questions, right? And so this is a big part of why, we want to work with schools like NCANT and like some of our other HBCUs to make sure that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there's someone who our students can talk to, who they can open up with, and let know that there are some of these challenges that they're going through, and um, and to know that there's someone on the other side who can help them. So this is just one of the ways in which we've seen our insight report become just more actionable for several of our partner colleges.
Yeah, it is so critical, that early intervention, and I think language is also really critical. And that was a big takeaway for me from the report, was about kind of the positive framing, the language that is used in um, suggesting services can really have an impact. Can you talk more about that?
So one of the things that we've seen is that is and this actually goes back to my experience as well. Back in college, I knew that I was, I felt like I was a fish out of water my freshman year, really trying to understand um, how to navigate just this new environment that is like half the size of my entire town that I grew up in. How do I how do I not just, become just this number that kind of falls out, and isn't able to get the support they're looking for, without raising my hand saying I need this help, I need this support, and then having everyone look at me as, oh, here's the guy from South Georgia who couldn't cut it, right? Um, and I think that that same stigma, whether it's a stigma based off of, you know, quite a few of our users are adult learners. So stigma of being older in a sea of younger students, or perhaps those who are veterans. So those who have been out of this environment and are suddenly thrust back in a new environment, um, or the stigma of being, a student parent, where perhaps you're a bit more exhausted than everyone else is, and you're still having to figure out how to make things work. All these things are reasons why perhaps people aren't always willing to raise their hand and say that they need help, right? And so, what we found, specifically with regards to talking about which of these services would be most helpful for you right now, is that if we just mention the services, we get some students who do raise their hand and say, yes, I need help with that one, but it's a much smaller result than if we take some of the sting and the stigma out of it. So even just something as simple as saying, hey, would you like to try, tutoring? It's really cool, or something like that is enough. Or to start with a joke. We did one where we started with a little pun on the way to asking for students about their mental health needs, and that was light enough to get students to actually reply back and say, I could use talking to someone right now. And those are the things that are nuances on the edge that I would say really help to ensure that our students are feeling less stigmatized, and are just much more willing to actually talk about the things that they're going through.
I'm just thinking about how impressive it is that, I talk to a lot of technology companies that help with uh, kind of product market fit in a lot of early stage companies. And I help other companies that are further along in different growth phases. And the one thing that is so hard to do is a student-facing app in terms of engagement. Like it's always a great idea to put students in a new app or in a new context to get them to engage in a new way. It's always a great idea, but in practice, it doesn't happen. Or that's where ideas die, is in student adoption. And so I'm just really curious, like, how did Upswing get to the point where your student adoption is driving this kind of impact and insight out of an annual report? Like, I mean, you must have really significant adoption. And I wondered, is it something that has to get cultivated on campuses over a period of time? Like, is there a strategy that has to get deployed that's very time intensive at the institution level? I mean, talk us through like the hard work of getting student engagement, because in order to get this insight, there's a lot of work that's gone into in getting them to show up and talk to Anna.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's it has been a journey. Let's say that. So there's a couple of things that I think um that you have to do, and some of these things are against kind of the norms, if you will, within the startup world, um, if you're going to be successful, right? So and this is where, as Laurie mentioned earlier, this is where I think having that lived experience really helps you to kind of, I think, stay myopically focused on what it takes, and not think that you can take shortcuts to get there. So the first thing is that if I'm a student, putting your self in the mind of a student who is in this new environment and has all these struggles, but is trying to put on, a brave face every day. Um, what does it look like to actually open one of these apps? To get started with one of these apps, how much, um, how desperate must you be, right? To actually decide that you're going to change up everything else that's happening in your life that's coming at you 100 miles an hour, and actually think about how to navigate a whole new experience. Um, that is why we've decided to take some of the things that we've done, and make it as easy as possible for students to get that help. So the first thing, right, is Anna. When we first started Anna, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, this should be an app," because back in 2013, 2014, everything that was cool was an app. And we were saying, no, this needs to be text. This needs to be over SMS, because students shouldn't have to have yet another barrier to getting that first set of help. The second thing is that, we've seen a lot of resources try and come, up with, and this isn't to be a dig at anyone. There are different motives and different ways that people try and approach it, but where perhaps the thing that you're talking to is a talking mascot, or is a, some other type of inanimate object. um I think back to my experience, and who I wanted to talk to was a person who wasn't going to stigmatize me. Like, that's exactly what I was looking for. I wasn't, maybe for more lighthearted things I would talk to a mascot, but I really want to talk to a person. And so what we wanted to do was figure out, how can we scale the idea of talking to a person. So that's the reason why Honest sends out its initial messages, and all that is using technology. We're able to respond automatically to some of the simpler questions. But then we actually have our own Anna team in house that replies back as Anna whenever a student has a more complex question or complex need. But the most critical part is that we, and I, had to kind of sometimes hammer this until I'm blue in the face. We do not want to be the end all be all answer for the student. We want to, almost, be the triage, if you will, for the student, right? And then send them to the hospital. So in this particular case, we know that campuses are the best place and the best solutions to get the true, answers to maybe concerns they're having or mental health needs that they're having or stressors that they have going on. So what we want to do is make sure that we triage the student, let them know that there's someone there that cares for them and that wants to make sure that they succeed. And then we actually want to make sure that we're referring them to the right place on campus. So we boast that for each one of our partners, we're delivering more than 200 referrals a month. And it can't just be a referral to say, you should go to the learning center and that's it. We need to make it as easy as possible for that to take place. And so that's why we created our platform. And our platform has all of these different departments on it already that already has their calendars, availability, and all that kind of stuff. So now all students have to do is just click the link within that text message, be taken directly to maybe their advisor or directly to maybe a campus tutor or a mental health provider and see when they're available to meet with them. And they can meet with them either in person or online. All that is about decreasing those barriers to access so that they can get exactly what they need exactly when they need it. So that's really been how we've taken that approach. And by making it as easy as possible, as simple as possible, by sending out, other types of messages to let them know that there are people who are watching over them and wanting to make sure they succeed, we're able to increase that engagement and ultimately increase those retention rate numbers.
Melvin, what you just described, having worked at a number of different institutions, and tried to move them to be more student experience centered, right? To come at it from a CX perspective, a customer experience perspective. We only talk that way. And I'm just curious because campuses often build structures, processes rooted in their own administrative siloed mindsets, right? It's institutional focused instead of like, and so as you've worked with your partner institutions, how you're describing this ideal situation where those links exist, where scheduling for a tutoring appointment online exists. I'm guessing you've helped advance campus cultures just by being a partner and raising those questions for some schools. Have you seen that kind of transformation happen?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about meeting people where they are. And given that these structures have been in place for a lot of campuses, we had to figure out how to meet the student where they are while also meeting each campus administrator where they are as well. We know that the same way that a student doesn't want to have to learn a whole new piece of technology when they're stressed, the administrator doesn't want to learn a whole new piece of technology when they're stressed as well. And so that's why our platform includes different modules where all we need them to do basically is to connect their calendar and basically populate their profile the same way they would on like a Facebook or something like that, and then set it and forget it. What we've learned from there is that as long as that is there, which we'll usually do as part of the onboarding process, students will then go in and start scheduling these sessions, looking for time. And as they start getting, the administrators start getting more and more alerts that, hey, this student wants to meet with you. Hey, this student wants to meet with you. And the link that says, go to dot, 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 Upswing. Um, that's when they begin to say, let me learn a little bit more about what this Upswing thing is. Because there's so many of my students that are trying to meet me there. And so that's how we've started to really help to navigate some of that culture. Now we have campuses coming to us saying, what would be great is if you could add this feature in and you could do this thing and you could, and so we're starting to get those types of conversations, which is where we want to be. We want to be in the place where they now get the idea that being a holistic experience for students is the ideal state. And so how can we make sure that together we're ensuring that takes place?
The impact on sort of taking down a lot of these silos makes me think about, I wanted to make sure we got an opportunity to ask you about this because I thought this also stood out. So in the career resources side of the world, there was some good engagement around career resources through Anna. And I'm just curious, like, again, with the silo, the removing siloed scenario. The career centers are often, the career services teams are often off to the side, and yet in our, it's interesting that there's an increased need or interest in it, through your report, right? And it's also really top of mind in today's culture about like the value of an education is like, how are we helping students with the end game relative to employment? And so when you see this kind of opportunity to potentially enable the career services side of the house, do you have any insights or examples from your experience where this has led institutions to sort of knock down some of those silos and maybe come up with some more proactive strategies for linking the academic experience to the career side, anything like that?
Yeah, and you're absolutely spot on. We're in a world now where um, students don't just take it as a given that going and pursuing higher education will necessarily turn into a degree that will pay them more than it's paying them today. So what we have to do is help them to, one, know what opportunities there are even out there. A lot of times, some people go to college because they don't necessarily like the job that they're in, and they want to be upwardly mobile in their career. Others, of course, may have been laid off. But then you have others who, and I would include more traditional age students in this as well, who are going to college because someone else told them, and they're not sure if it's even worth it. Um, and then they start to receive these bills, and they're then very sure it's not worth it. And they're seeing their friends, saying things like, "Hey, I got this trucking job that is paying me six figures," and now they're quitting right before the end of their first year to say, let me try and do this as well, as opposed to some of these other opportunities. I heard one administrator tell me that today the single biggest competitor to them is not another institution, it's DoorDash. Right, we know that people are thinking about how they can figure out what's going to benefit them the most in the quickest amount of time. And so that pulls this idea of career services back into the fold from exactly where you were saying, Darin. Not being just this thing that just is on the other side, but it needs to be part of the conversation that's taking place. So part of what we've tried to do to help institutions navigate that is, again, we know that the structures have been in place. We certainly have some ideas for how we can make sure to you know knock down some of those walls and those barriers. But if we can do some of those things, some of that heavy lifting on our side, hopefully that'll be helpful as well. So actually, just this year, we started a series of what we call Upswing workshops, and these workshops are provided across all of our partners who participate. They're usually 3 or 4 times a week, and the whole idea is to help students get information from experts about different careers that might be of interest to them, about resume prep, about cover letters, how to interview, especially because a lot of these students, came of age during COVID. These are things that are new to them. And so what we're doing is we're trying to help them to get an early leg up on some of those career services type aspects, and then sharing that data back with the institution, showing that, hey, a growing percentage of your students are clamoring for this type of insight and this type of information, not just how to get help in my writing class, but actually how to write a cover letter. And if we can help them to uncover that, then ideally in the next semester or the next year, they start to think more and more about how they can incorporate these initiatives into the overall collegiate experience so that students feel a lot more like this is the pathway for them to have that upper mobility.
Do students from different populations, from your research and experience, um, engage with those support services differently. So you've got online students versus kind of campus-based students, non-traditional versus 18 to 24-year-olds, etc.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we do see differences in terms of what they're looking for. I think one of the most interesting things that we've noticed, especially this year, there's a tiny call out of that in our data, is that students that are because college can look kind of bimodal, right? You have the, like you mentioned, 18-24 year olds, and then you have some of the older populations, and there is a bit of a valley in the middle. The students that are in that kind of 18 to 24-year-old range, you know, in terms of feeling a sense of community, they want to know about different clubs on campus. They want to know about different social activities. The more that you can create that sense of belonging, the greater the likelihood that you can get them to stay. In fact, I remember one of our partners, Durham Tech, was talking about that with their minority male mentoring program. That they created that specifically because they noticed that students uh, of that demographic were quitting before they ever even got their first, substantial grades. And if they could create this program, they could create that likelihood that they're going to stay in, they're going to motivate each other, etc. But on the other part, they're less interested in um, social groups and things like that, but they do still want connection. They're more interested in networking opportunities. Um, they're more interested in things that they see as potentially having a greater direct opportunity to give them that upward mobility that they're looking for. And so they still want connection, but it's a different form and different type of connection. And so we have seen that show up in our data over the course of the last year's executive or on a insight report.
Yeah, really important, especially as colleges are for colleges who serve significant populations of both, right? You really got to think about how your programming is geared, what your language is, as your. It can be easy to be to swing one way or the other.
Uh, Melvin, I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. I think um, it's amazing that I have the same feeling this year that I did last year, where I'm hearing the results. I'm hearing about and thinking about the results that are coming out of this report, and I'm thinking, how is it that this data is so richly available through through your work? And you really gave us a strong sense of not just where the data comes from and how important it is, but also just I hadn't really thought about how much of a impetus this can be for institutional change. That the types of information that you're putting out is really it's a guide. It's a guidebook for institutions, whether they're the institutions that are directly seeing the impact from their own use of Upswing's products, or whether there are other institutions that were to pick this up and look at it and start to think about it strategically. I think you've given a great, you've done a great service, I think, to the higher ed community with this. But Laurie, I don't want to be the last word on any of this. Do you have any other questions for Melvin that we should make sure we cover before we let him go?
Well, I was curious about how much of a change there was in student sentiment from your insights this year to last year and where that sat. I mean, you talked at the beginning a little bit about kind of big picture, and maybe we wrap up with some big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was one of the big things that was a surprise to us, was how forthcoming people were about some of the changes in their sentiment. Um, you know, what we want to do at any given time is just ask them the general questions and let them have open response answers back to us, just in case we've missed something. And certainly what we've seen this year is that the sentiment, that positive sentiment about feeling good about where you are as a student currently going through what you're going through, we saw that take a dip this year. It dropped by about a third from where it was last year. And when we asked students, what could we do to help you to maybe feel better about where you are there certain resources that we can point you to? Certainly there were quite a few students that asked for different resources, and the honest insights report talked about all those different types of resources. But then we had students that said, I'm just looking for positive encouragement. um, that was one of the top responses that students asked for. And secondary to that was, I just need help with understanding my future and where do I go from here. What I'm learning from this, what I'm gleaning from this, is that we've talked a lot over the course of the last 12 to 18 months about all these different just mechanics and things like that with providing higher education. But maybe what we need to do is just get back to making sure that we're serving our students in the best way possible. If they're no longer feeling happy, feeling comfortable, feeling satisfied with what we're offering them, then we can really start to see that impact in terms of what it looks like next year. Will students return? Will they not return? And I, fervently believe, as a student who is a product of South Georgia, a product of the South, that for a certain community and group of students that are out there, or people that are out there in the United States, higher education is the ticket to upward mobility. Um, it provides a level of access that, even though it might seem like it with, some of the, like we were talking about earlier, some of the truck driving opportunities, some of maybe social media influencers and things like that. This one is something that people can't take away from you. Um, and I would hate to see more of those students from those communities not complete because they've lost faith in our ability to get them to the finish line and to get them to what they, are looking for ultimately. And so my hope, my takeaway, my hope is that the takeaway of this report is that people will, take time to read it, to review it, and then really start to ask themselves, how can we get these students back to that level of sentiment that they need to be at to endure the challenges that are happening, that are coming at them, not just within those doors, but outside the doors as well, to ultimately see themselves walk across that stage, getting that diploma and feeding their family and providing upper mobility for themselves, because this is their greatest ticket, their greatest opportunity. And we want to make sure that we can help them as much as we can.
Well said. I think this has been a really I don't know, I'll call it a sobering conversation, to be honest, because I think I think I knew the seriousness of what we were talking about, having read the report, but I felt like the context that you bring and the examples that you share just drive it home even more. So I hope that this can be at least one more voice out there in the wilderness that's pointing to some really important data that can help us do better. So thank you for taking the time, Melvin. This has been really great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me.